On May 21st, 1987, a young woman's scream was never heard. Her body was discovered in silence. 35 years of silence would follow. I'm Yoonjin Lee, and this is her story. Shannon Rose Lloyd was only 23 years old, beautiful, petite, with dreams that should have carried her into a long, full life. But on that cold May evening in Garden Grove, California, someone took everything from her. Someone who thought they had committed the perfect crime. For 35 years, her killer walked free. For 35 years, her family waited for answers. For 35 years, the case file gathered dust on a detective's shelf in Orange County. But everything changed in 2021 when modern science proved something extraordinary. No crime is perfect anymore. No killer can hide forever. Because DNA, the invisible code that makes us who we are, never forgets. This is the story of how investigative genetic genealogy solved an unsolved mystery. This is the story of how a family finally received justice. And this is the story of how Shannon Rose Lloyd, after 35 years in the shadows, finally told us who murdered her. Do you believe science can solve what seemed impossible? What would you sacrifice to find justice? Could your DNA be the key to solving a decades-old crime? If you want to discover how modern forensic science is revolutionizing cold case investigations, please subscribe and turn on your notifications. We explore the stories that the justice system almost forgot, the victims whose names almost faded away, the cases that prove justice never expires. Let's find the truth together. May 1987. The United States was a different world. Ronald Reagan had been president for 6 years. The Cold War was still raging. No one carried a computer in their pocket. The internet existed only in universities and military facilities. Social media hadn't been invented. The news cycle took days. If you wanted to know what happened across the country, you waited for the evening television broadcast. In Southern California, Orange County was experiencing explosive growth. The 1980s brought prosperity to the region. Neighborhoods that had been agricultural fields just decades before were now filled with new homes. Families were moving west in search of opportunity and sunshine. The economy was booming. People believed in the future. Garden Grove was a typical Southern California suburban community. Located in Orange County, between Anaheim and Santa Ana, it was a working-class city. The streets were lined with modest homes, small apartment complexes, and rental properties. Donna Lane, where Shannon Lloyd rented her room, was a quiet residential street with single-family homes and a few rental houses converted into individual rooms and small apartments. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors knew each other's cars, but not always their business, where doors were left unlocked sometimes, where people felt relatively safe, though crime was never absent. The air smelled of gasoline and blooming desert flowers. The warm evening breeze carried the sounds of families eating dinner, children playing outside before dark, the distant hum of the Los Angeles metropolitan area just a few miles away. Garden Grove in May was pleasant. The heat hadn't yet become oppressive. The ocean was close enough to occasionally feel the marine layer in the mornings, but beneath the surface of suburban normalcy, danger lurked. Predators walked these streets. Criminals planned their crimes in apartments and cars. And on May 21st, 1987, a young woman's life would end in violence that seemed absolutely impossible to solve. The technology that would eventually catch her killer didn't exist yet. DNA databases wouldn't be created for years. Genetic genealogy was pure science fiction. The internet wouldn't be invented until the early 1990s. The idea that you could trace someone's family tree using DNA submitted to a public database would have sounded like something from a futuristic movie. In 1987, the future hadn't arrived yet. There was no way to know that this case would become one of the most important examples of how modern science could solve the impossible. There was no way to know that 35 years later, this murder would change how law enforcement thought about cold cases forever. But it started that evening, May 21st, 1987. Around 11:45 p.m., on Donna Lane in Garden Grove, California, Shannon Rose Lloyd was 23 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was petite, slender and delicate-looking, with shoulder-length brown hair. Neighbors who knew her described her as attractive, sweet, and quiet. She had a son whom she loved deeply. She had a boyfriend who visited her regularly. She was working to build a stable life for herself and her child. Shannon lived in a rented room in a house on Donna Lane. It wasn't much, just a bedroom in a residential house that the owner had converted into rental units. Many young people and families lived this way in Southern California. It was affordable. It was a way to get started. It was supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone to something better. Her neighbors noticed her occasionally. There was the 50-year-old landlord, Casimir Bursuk, who lived in the same house. There were other neighbors, people who lived their own lives and didn't pay too much attention to anyone else. This was Southern California. People minded their own business. One neighbor, Charles King, who lived nearby, remembered Shannon well. He described her as an attractive petite woman with a son. He mentioned that her boyfriend visited frequently, but he also mentioned something else. He'd seen some rough characters visit the house occasionally, people he couldn't identify, people who didn't look like they belonged in the quiet residential neighborhood. According to the police investigation that would follow, Shannon had lived a relatively normal young adult life. She had friends. She had family who cared about her. She was working to build something better. But her situation made her vulnerable. She was alone most of the time. She was living in a room in a house full of strangers. She was a young woman in a city where predators roamed. Over the years, police had been called to the house on Donna Lane on at least 3 occasions before Shannon's death. The reasons were never fully documented in the records that would later become public, but something in the neighborhood suggested trouble, something hinted at danger. Yet no one could have predicted what would happen on May 21st, 1987. Shannon had no enemies that anyone knew of. There were no death threats. There were no signs of stalking. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was simply a young woman trying to make a life for herself and her son. But on that evening in May, someone decided that her life would end. Someone who lived or worked in the Garden Grove area. Someone who had access to her room. Someone who knew she would be alone. Someone whose evil no one could have anticipated. And for 35 years, no one would know who that person was. May 21st, 1987 started like any other day. Shannon Rose Lloyd woke up in her rented room. Sunlight filtered through the windows of the modest house on Donna Lane. Somewhere in Garden Grove, a typical Southern California Thursday was beginning. The weather was perfect, warm, clear. The kind of day that made people glad to live in Southern California. Shannon had things to do that day, mundane things, the kinds of things that fill an ordinary day. She was a young mother and a young woman with responsibilities. She likely spent part of the day caring for her son, who was living with her or staying with her on certain days. She may have been working or looking for work. She had relationships to maintain, errands to run, a life to live. No one recorded the specific details of her Thursday. No one was paying attention. She was just a young woman going through her day in a quiet California neighborhood. No one noticed anything unusual or significant. But somewhere in Orange County, someone was making plans. The afternoon progressed. May 21st, 1987 continued like thousands of other May 21st before and after. The sun moved across the sky. People went about their lives. Businesses operated. Traffic moved on the Southern California freeways. The world turned without any sense that something terrible was about to happen. Evening came. Around 7 p.m., darkness began to fall. Shannon was in her room. This much we know from the investigation that would follow. She was in her bedroom when someone came to her door. Who it was, we don't know with certainty. It could have been someone she knew. It could have been a stranger. It could have been someone she had let in, or someone who forced their way inside. What we know is what happened next. Violence, sexual assault, strangulation, the brutal end of a young woman's life. The details are painful to consider. Shannon Rose Lloyd fought for her life. She struggled against her attacker. She tried to escape, but the person who had come to her room that night was stronger, or armed, or both. The autopsy that would be performed later revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. It revealed that she had died by strangulation. It revealed the violence of her death, but it would not reveal who had killed her. Around 11:45 p.m. that night, Kasimir Bursuk, the 50-year-old landlord who lived in the same house, discovered something terrifying. He went to Shannon's room and found her body. She was dead. The police were called immediately. Neighbors were told to stay in their homes. The quiet residential street on Donna Lane suddenly filled with sirens and flashing lights. The house where Shannon lived became a crime scene. The room where she had spent so many evenings became a place of horror. Detectives arrived. Evidence was collected. Photographs were taken. But what they found was a puzzle with no immediate solution. There was no clear suspect. There were no obvious leads. There was a young woman murdered in her locked room, but no visible path to her killer. She was sexually assaulted and strangled, Detective Chuck Gibbs told reporters the next morning. We're investigating it as a sexual assault and homicide. But how would they find him? The morning of May 22, 1987 dawned bright and clear in Orange County. The news of Shannon Rose Lloyd's death spread quickly through Garden Grove and the surrounding area. Garden Grove Police Chief Tom DeRay opened a homicide investigation. Detective teams were assembled. The house on Donna Lane was cordoned off. Forensic specialists began collecting evidence from the crime scene. What they found was both revealing and frustratingly vague. There was no forced entry. The door had either been unlocked or Shannon had voluntarily let her killer inside. This suggested she may have known her attacker, or at least trusted him enough to let him into her room, or perhaps she had simply forgotten to lock her door, something people did more often in 1987 than they might do today. There was no property missing. The killer had not stolen anything. This was not a robbery. This was not about money or material goods. This was about violence and control. The sexual assault was evident. DNA technology existed in limited forms in 1987, but it was primitive compared to what would come later. The forensic samples collected, bodily fluids, hair, anything that might contain the killer's biological material, were preserved according to the methods available at the time. Detective Chuck Gibbs and other investigating officers interviewed Kasimir Bursuk, the man who discovered the body. He was questioned extensively. Where had he been that evening? What did he see? What did he hear? Was he involved? Bursuk cooperated fully with the investigation. He was not a suspect. Police determined that he had no involvement in Shannon's death. Other neighbors were interviewed. Charles King spoke about the rough characters he'd seen visiting the house occasionally. Were any of them suspects? Could any of them have been Shannon's killer? Investigators explored every angle. They looked at Shannon's boyfriend. They examined her family relationships. They investigated her friends and acquaintances. Did anyone have a motive? Did anyone have access? Did anyone fit the pattern? But leads went nowhere. Interviews produced no solid suspects. Forensic evidence was collected and preserved. But in 1987, DNA analysis was not the powerful investigative tool it would become. The samples were stored, but they couldn't immediately tell detectives who had killed Shannon. Days turned into weeks. The investigation remained active, but no arrests were made. No suspects emerged from the interviews. No breakthrough occurred. As summer progressed, the case began to lose its urgency in the eyes of the media and the public. New stories emerged. Other crimes demanded attention. Shannon Rose Lloyd's murder was no longer front-page news. But for her family, the investigation never lost urgency. Every day without answers was an agony. Every day without justice was a reminder of their loss. Who killed our daughter? Her family asked. Who took Shannon from us? No one could answer. The investigation into Shannon Rose Lloyd's death continued through the summer of 1987, but progress was slow. Detectives followed every lead they could identify. They interviewed dozens of people. They examined the forensic evidence collected at the crime scene, but the case remained unsolved. The killer, whoever he was, had left no obvious evidence at the scene, or the evidence he had left, his DNA, was something that couldn't be analyzed with the technology available in 1987. The initial weeks of investigation were the most intense. Detectives worked overtime. Resources were dedicated to finding Shannon's killer. Every possible angle was examined, but each promising lead eventually went cold. Was it someone who lived in the neighborhood? Someone who knew Shannon? Someone who had targeted her specifically? Or was it a random attack by a passing stranger? Investigators could not determine the answer. The media attention that had surrounded the case in those first days after her death began to fade. Local television stations moved on to other stories. The newspaper coverage became less frequent. The public's attention shifted, but for Shannon's family, the absence of answers was crushing. They had lost someone they loved. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother to their young grandchild, and they had lost something else, the hope that her killer might quickly be found and brought to justice. As summer turned to fall, the investigation began to take on a different character. The frantic energy of the first days gave way to a more methodical process. New leads were harder to come by. Detective work became routine rather than urgent. The case file grew thicker with interviews, reports, and forensic findings. But despite all the documentation, there was still no answer to the fundamental question: who killed Shannon Rose Lloyd? In Orange County, life continued. Other crimes demanded attention. Other cases moved through the justice system. And Shannon's case, while never officially closed, began to slide down the list of active investigations. Police kept the file open. Investigators remained available if new leads emerged. But no new evidence came. No new witnesses came forward with crucial information. Shannon Rose Lloyd's murder was becoming a cold case, and she was becoming one of hundreds of unsolved homicides in California. Years passed. Time moved forward without answers. Every year on May 21st, Shannon's family felt the pain of her loss anew. Every birthday that came and went reminded them of how old their daughter would have been if she were still alive. They watched her son grow up without his mother. They tried to maintain hope that someday justice would come. But the investigation had gone cold. By 1988, the case was no longer receiving much detective attention. Other murders demanded resources. Other victims' families needed answers. The limited investigative capacity of the Garden Grove Police Department and the Orange County Sheriff's Department had to be directed toward active cases with more promising leads. Shannon's file was still open, but it was essentially dormant. In 1989, something significant happened, but no one realized it at the time. Another woman was murdered in Orange County. Her name was Renee Cuevas. She was 27 years old. Her body was found on February 19, 1989, along Lambert Road near the El Toro Marine Base, not far from where Shannon had been killed. At first, the two cases seemed unrelated. Different circumstances, different locations, different victims. But in 2003, 16 years later, the Orange County Crime Lab made a crucial connection. DNA samples from Shannon Lloyd's murder and DNA samples from Renee Cuevas's murder matched. The same man had killed both women. This discovery was significant. It meant that Shannon's case was not a random, isolated crime. It meant that the killer was a serial predator who had struck multiple times. But most importantly, it meant that law enforcement now had additional evidence to work with. If they could find the killer of Renee Cuevas, they would also solve Shannon's murder. But the investigation remained stalled. The 2003 discovery that the murders were linked did not immediately produce a suspect. The DNA profile of the killer was entered into law enforcement databases. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, was searched for matches, but no match was found. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require his DNA to be submitted to CODIS. So Shannon's case remained unsolved, and Renee Cuevas's case remained unsolved. The years continued to pass. 1990s, 2000s. The internet was invented. Email became common. Cell phones appeared and then became ubiquitous. Digital cameras replaced film. Life transformed. Technology advanced. But Shannon's case remained unchanged, cold, unsolved, waiting for a breakthrough that seemed unlikely to ever come. Her family aged. Some died without ever seeing justice for Shannon. Her son grew into adulthood without his mother. The pain never fully healed. The questions never were answered. In the detective squad rooms of Orange County, Shannon's case file sat in a box with hundreds of other unsolved murders. Another victim who didn't get justice. Another family left with incomplete closure. It seemed like her killer had committed the perfect crime. He had lived a free life after murdering 2 women. He had never been arrested for their murders. He had never even been a suspect, as far as the investigation could determine. But he didn't know something. No one in 1987 could have known it. Technology was coming that would change everything. The year was 2021. The place was Garden Grove, California. 34 years after Shannon Rose Lloyd was murdered, the Orange County District Attorney's Office launched an investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG team. This team was dedicated to using advanced DNA technology to solve cold cases. Investigative genetic genealogy was a revolutionary development in forensic science. It had first gained widespread attention in 2018, when it was used to identify and capture Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer who had evaded law enforcement for decades. Here's how IgG works. When investigators have DNA evidence from a suspect in a crime, they can now submit that DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, Ancestry, 23andMe, and others. People use these databases to explore their family history and discover distant relatives. When DNA from a crime scene is entered into these databases, it can match with DNA from relatives of the suspect. Even if the suspect himself has never submitted his DNA to any database, his relatives may have done so. And through the genetic relationships revealed in these family trees, investigators can work backward to identify the suspect. It's an astonishing tool, and it has revolutionized cold case investigations. In 2021, the Orange County District Attorney's investigative genetic genealogy team examined the case of Shannon Rose Lloyd. They had DNA evidence from the crime scene. They had the DNA profile that had been determined in 2003 to match the DNA from Renee Cuevas's murder scene. They submitted that DNA profile to genetic genealogy databases, and they got a match. The match pointed to a family in Las Vegas, Nevada. The genealogy team analyzed the family tree. They traced the connections, and they identified a possible suspect, Reuben J. Smith. Reuben Smith had lived in Orange County in the 1980s. He had been born in 1959 or 1960. The records varied slightly. He was the right age. He was in the right place at the right time. His family connections, as revealed by the genetic genealogy analysis, made him a strong possible suspect. But there was something else, something even more significant. In 1998, Reuben Smith had been arrested in Las Vegas on suspicion of sexual assault and attempted murder. At the time of his arrest, a DNA sample had been taken from him. That sample had been stored in law enforcement databases. When the investigators compared that 1998 DNA sample from Reuben Smith to the DNA evidence from Shannon Lloyd's murder scene and from Renee Cuevas's murder scene, it was a perfect match. The same man. 35 years after Shannon Rose Lloyd was murdered, science had identified her killer. His name was Reuben J. Smith, but there was a problem. Reuben J. Smith had committed suicide in 1999. He had died more than 20 years before he was identified as a suspect in Shannon's murder. There would be no trial. There would be no arrest. There would be no opportunity for Reuben Smith to deny the charges or to plead guilty. The justice system could not prosecute him. But his identity was known. The mystery was solved. Shannon's family finally knew who had killed their daughter, and the world could see how revolutionary investigative genetic genealogy had become. Once the Orange County District Attorney's investigative genetic genealogy team identified Reuben J. Smith as a possible suspect through genetic genealogy analysis, a much more thorough investigation was launched. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case, the Garden Grove Police Department, the Orange County Sheriff's Department, and the Orange County District Attorney's Office, worked together to verify the genetic genealogy findings and to develop a complete picture of Reuben Smith and his connection to Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. The team examined Reuben Smith's background. Where had he lived? When had he lived in Orange County? Who did he know? What was his history? Reuben Smith had lived in Orange County during the 1980s. This matched the time period of Shannon Lloyd's 1987 murder and Renee Cuevas's 1989 murder. The timeline fit. In 1998, about 9 years after he killed Shannon and Renee, Reuben Smith was arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada. The arrest was for sexual assault and attempted murder. He had attacked a woman, attempted to kill her, but she had fought back. She had resisted. She had survived. The evil in him, the woman would later say in a statement released by the district attorney's office. I know if I didn't fight, I was going to die. It was horrible. The things that he did, the things that he said. He told me he was going to kill me. This 1998 arrest revealed Reuben Smith's true nature. He was a predator. He was capable of extreme violence. He was a man who attacked women. He was a man who attempted to kill. And now, it was clear that he had killed before, in 1987 and 1989 in Orange County. The investigators compared the DNA from Reuben Smith's 1998 arrest with the DNA evidence from the Lloyd and Cuevas crime scenes. It was a perfect match. All 3 samples contained the same DNA profile. Reuben Smith had sexually assaulted and murdered Shannon Rose Lloyd in May 1987. Reuben Smith had murdered Renee Cuevas in February 1989. Reuben Smith had attempted to murder a 3rd woman in July 1998, but she had survived. He was a serial predator. He had victimized multiple women over more than a decade. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was definitive. The mystery was solved. What had seemed impossible to solve in 1987 had become solvable through 21st century technology in 2021. Modern science had revealed what conventional detective work could not. On July 26, 2022, the Orange County District Attorney announced the resolution of 2 of the county's most notorious cold cases. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer held a press conference. He revealed that investigative genealogy had identified Reuben J. Smith as the killer of both Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. The justice that every victim deserves was hidden away in DNA, District Attorney Spitzer said. But with advances in IgG technology combined with the relentless dedication of generations of detectives and the talented prosecutors and forensic scientists at the district attorney's office, we now know who killed Renee and Shannon. Garden Grove Police Chief Tom Darray expressed his hope that this case would encourage future cold case investigations. The advancements in DNA science and the work of the IgG unit has been instrumental in solving our second cold case homicide within the past 12 months, Chief Darray said. I know with our continued partnership with the Orange County District Attorney's Office, we will be able to solve many more cold cases and bring closure to the family members of these victims. The facts were laid out clearly. On May 21, 1987, Shannon Rose Lloyd was sexually assaulted and strangled to death in her rented bedroom in Garden Grove. On February 19, 1989, Renee Cuevas was murdered by the same man, Reuben J. Smith. In 2003, the Orange County Crime Lab linked the 2 murders through DNA evidence. In 2021, investigative genealogy identified Reuben J. Smith as the killer. Smith had lived in Orange County during the 1980s. He had the access and opportunity to commit these crimes. In 1998, Smith was arrested in Las Vegas for sexual assault and attempted murder of another woman. At that time, DNA was collected and stored. The DNA from his 1998 arrest matched perfectly with the DNA evidence from the Lloyd and Cuevas crime scenes. Smith died by suicide on October 31, 1999, at the age of 39. He never faced trial for the murders of Shannon and Renee. He never spent time in prison for his crimes against them, but he was identified. His name was revealed. The mystery was solved. For Shannon's family, and for Renee's family, the announcement brought a complicated mixture of emotions. There was a measure of closure. They finally knew who had killed their loved ones. They finally knew that the killer had been identified through modern science. But there was no trial. There was no opportunity to hear a guilty verdict from a jury. There was no chance to see the killer face legal consequences. The killer had already faced consequences. He had died by his own hand, but not through the justice system. Not in a way that would have satisfied the family's need for closure through the courts. Still, the truth was known. Science had revealed what human investigators could not solve for 35 years. When news of the cold case resolution was made public in July 2022, reactions were profound. Shannon Lloyd's family received a message they had waited 35 years to hear. "We know who killed your daughter. We know what happened. We have evidence. We have proof." It wasn't the justice they might have hoped for, a trial, a conviction, a sentence, but it was closure. It was an answer. It was an end to the not knowing. The community of Garden Grove also received this news as significant. The case had haunted the city for decades. An unsolved murder in a quiet residential neighborhood. A young woman killed for no discernible reason. It was the kind of case that makes people feel vulnerable. It is the kind of mystery that reminds us that danger can be closer than we want to believe. The resolution of this case through investigative genetic genealogy became a turning point in how law enforcement thought about cold cases. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer announced that 4 homicides had been solved through investigative genetic genealogy in Orange County since the technology had been implemented. Nationwide, more than 200 cold cases had been closed through the use of this revolutionary technology. Justice does not have an expiration date, District Attorney Spitzer declared. That statement became the motto of the new era in cold case investigations. Cases that had been dormant for decades were being reopened. DNA evidence from old crime scenes was being submitted to genetic genealogy databases. Families that had waited years were finally receiving answers. The Reuben J. Smith case became a famous example of what genetic genealogy could accomplish. It demonstrated that even 35 years of uncertainty could be resolved through modern science. It showed that a killer could be identified long after a crime, even if he was no longer alive to face legal consequences. Law enforcement agencies across the country began implementing investigative genetic genealogy programs. Universities began researching and teaching the technology. Forensic scientists became experts in the field. It was a revolution in how crimes were solved, but it also raised important questions. Questions about privacy, questions about consent, questions about the ethics of using public genealogy databases to solve crimes. Those questions would continue to be debated, but for the families of Shannon and Renee, those abstract questions about privacy seemed less important than the concrete reality of finally knowing the truth. 35 years. That's how long Shannon Lloyd's family waited for answers. For 35 years, the question remained unanswered. Who killed our daughter? Who took her from us? Who committed this terrible crime? For 35 years, her son grew up without his mother. Her family aged without receiving closure. The pain never fully healed. And then, in 2021, science answered the question. Investigative genetic genealogy identified Reuben J. Smith as Shannon's killer. He was a predator. He was a man capable of extreme violence. He was a man who had killed at least 2 women and attempted to kill a third. He was the embodiment of evil in human form. But he had died by suicide in 1999, before his crimes were solved. He had lived his life without facing the legal consequences for what he had done. He had escaped the justice system in death. Yet his identity was revealed. The mystery was solved. The truth was known. This case represents so much about how we have changed as a society. It represents the power of modern science. It represents the determination of law enforcement to solve cases that had seemed unsolvable. It represents the hope that justice can come, even after decades of waiting. But it also represents the pain of families left behind. It represents the tragedy of lives cut short. It represents the reality that not all cases end with a trial and a conviction. Some cases end with knowledge, the knowledge of who did it, even if legal consequences are impossible. If Shannon could speak, what would she say? Perhaps she would say, "Remember me. Don't forget my name. Don't forget that I existed. Don't forget that my life mattered, even though it was cut short." Perhaps she would say, "Use science. Use technology. Use every tool available to find the truth. The truth is worth waiting for, even if the wait takes 35 years. Perhaps she would say, support your families, love the people you care about, because life is fragile. A life can end in an instant. The time we have with the people we love is precious. What do you think about this case? What do you think about investigative genetic genealogy? Do you believe it's the future of solving cold cases? If you have thoughts about this case, please share them in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to telling the stories that the justice system almost forgot. The stories of victims whose names almost faded away. The stories that prove justice never expires. Thank you for watching the story of Shannon Lloyd. Thank you for remembering her name. Thank you for believing that the truth matters. This is Yoon-Jin Lee, reminding you that in the pursuit of justice, no case is too old to solve, no victim is forgotten, and no truth is buried forever.